Good evening. Thanks for coming. We are trying to package about 100 years in about 1 hour, so please bear with us. There will be many gaps of information, but we wanted to give you a glimpse from the past. So what me and Paul have decided, I'll do some basic introduction to who the Sikhs are, and then Paul will take over for the historic perspective for our county as well as Pacific Northwest. And then I will come back and talk about where we are today, last 30, 40 years, and how it is progressing as we look at it from the perspective of year 2000 or second millennia. Sikh religion is very young religion, only 500 years old, started in what is called Pakistan now. That was all one India at one time. And it's monotheistic religion. And we are kind of conspicuous because people wear turbans and beards, and that's how you can tell. But there are a lot of people like me also who are Sikhs. So, but that's more or less is the background. And there are about 1 million Sikhs living in North America right now. That's between US and Canada. To give you a perspective, this is the area you can see China, current India, and current Pakistan. You can see there are two Punjabs. They have a Punjab state, we have a Punjab state. They have a Punjab university, we have a Punjab university. Because there was one province and was arbitrarily divided in 1947 and made into India and Pakistan. So our culture is same, our food is same, our language is same. But it's two separate places. But this kind of gives you an idea of New Delhi. We are north of New Delhi. And it is in the Pakistan, you see Lahore, and a little bit of, I would say, east of that was where the first Sikh guru was born, or the Sikhism started. This is the story of the Sikh diaspora in the sense that Sikhs have been very enterprising people, right from last 300-400 years. Even they have always been in minority, but you can see that they were the first people to come to East Africa, like all the Kenya and Tanzania, South Africa. There were a lot of Sikhs were there. There were only two people from India, Gujaratis, that's a province, and then Punjabis. They were the first people who came out and settled. And same is even in America. These are the two people who came early. People from rest of the India have been coming only once the internet was invented, all the software people. So before that, it was mostly either Gujaratis or Punjabis who ventured out. But they went, of course, in England, of course, in Australia, and of course, in Shanghai. In 1937 to 47, the most Sikh people outside of Punjab were in China. And in Malaysia, Indonesia, all these places, they are all over. Actually, King George V invited the Sikhs when there was a coronation of the king in England. He invited the Sikh army generals and other people to come to the coronation, and then he advised them that before you go back to India, go to Canada. And then you go, because they knew the enterprising spirit of the Sikhs. And they thought that would be the best to populate or grow Canada would be bring the Sikhs to this place, because they have dealt with them for 100 years. They knew what kind of people they are. And that's why they came to Toronto, and then they came to Vancouver. So that was the first introduction in late 1890s. That's how the Sikhs actually came to North America. And they could come there because it was a British Dominion. You don't need any papers. You could come there, but you can't come to America. So the Sikh army was, they have served in the English army in First and Second World War. And if you look at these days with YouTube, when the France was liberated, the first army entered was the Sikh army. And the 7 Sikh soldiers received Victoria Cross. That's the highest award one could get. Then I want to tell you that Astoria, India people came, they didn't only come for search of a better life and jobs and everything. There was an innate desire. They remembered that America was the only place which defied the British throne and became free. So they looked to America that if we go them, we can obtain their help to overthrow the English government. That was innate desire of a lot of people who came here. And you know, the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley, was the birthplace of the Indian freedom movement. A lot of people, Astoria, they would not, the California laws were such, they would not let them form any formal organizations in those days, in early 1900s. But in Astoria, in Oregon, there were lumber mills all over on the coast, including Bellingham. So there were friendly people in Astoria, and the mayor at that time said, we don't mind, you guys want to come and form an organization here. So the birthplace of Indian Ghadar movement, Ghadar actually means revolutionary movement, was in Astoria. There is a plaque in 2013. They had a ceremony, and the mayor put a plaque right on the waterfront in Astoria in memory of that forming of that organization. And they got together, they collected money, and they bought arms, and they organized with Indian Army in Calcutta, and they wanted to go there and do that. They did actually go there, but there was a British agent in Vancouver who found out about this thing, and they were informed by cable before they reached there. And several hundred people got killed even before they got off the ship. So, I mean, there's a lot of things behind it. The first Sikh temple was built in Golden, BC. Golden is on border of Alberta and BC. They were the railroad workers, so that's where the first temple, but it got demolished or they moved away. But the other old temples are one in Abbotsford. It's a heritage site for the government of Canada in Abbotsford, was built in 1908, and the other one, the earliest one, was in Stockton. So I will start from here again. When I come back to the current situation, I will let Paul now take over. Thank you.
A little update to the plaque that Satpal was mentioning in Astoria. It got vandalized, I think, October of last year, and I just got an email the other day from a fellow researcher in Oregon who invited us to the rededication. They're putting in a new plaque on April 7th, I think. So I said, I can't come to that, but I hope you can come to Bellingham for the dedication of our arch. So we're kind of trading invitations. But it was a big deal in 2013. I was there for that whole recognition of the birth of the Ghadar movement 100 years before. I'm going to really cover a very short period of time in Sikh history, just a 2-year period, but for Whatcom County and Bellingham, it's a very important period of time because it was the only time in these early days of the immigration of people from Punjab, most of whom were Sikhs, to North America, to the Pacific Northwest. It was a very short-lived stay, but very eventful. And a lot of people in Bellingham, although we've been talking about this for the last few years, especially since 2007, which was the 100th anniversary, a lot of people in Bellingham aren't aware of this history, but people just looking at Asian American history, Bellingham has a chapter in all these books. Well, this book, this most recent book out of Canada, has several pages, but Bellingham and what happened in Bellingham is quite well known among people who study or even take a survey course in Asian American history. But what's kind of curious is among a lot of people in Whatcom County, they're not aware of this. And so that's something I've been trying to research in the last 11 years or so now. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of what I've learned, and with some illustrations, focusing mostly on who these people were and a little bit of how they were received in Whatcom County. I'm going to say Bellingham, but it wasn't just Bellingham. So in around 1906, there started to be more and more ships coming into Canada, into Vancouver and Victoria, carrying hundreds of Punjabis. And you probably can't see this very well, but the names, almost all of them are Singh, S-I-N-G-H, Singh, Singh, Singh. And Satpal didn't mention this, but and I'm not really an expert on Sikh culture, but one thing that is obvious when you do the research, it's very hard to identify who is who, because there was I don't know if it was a decree or official, but men were all supposed to take the name of Singh, and women were to take the name of Kaur, K-A-U-R, and it was to break the caste system. The Sikhs were against the Hindu caste system, which was great to try to break the caste system, but for historians, it's a real headache, because I'm trying to find out, who was this Inder Singh who was in Bellingham in the newspaper, and I find on these ship's logs there's like 10 different Inder Singhs, and which one is the one who came to Bellingham? But anyway, this was kind of a momentous thing when these ships began to arrive, and the Canadian newspapers and the Washington State newspapers started really worrying. It was one of these yellow peril fears that what's going to happen when thousands of people from India flood our shores? And this had happened with China also, but it really started happening in 1906. In 1905, there were a few people from India coming into Washington, but it really started more in the 1906 period. And these are just some pictures of some of the early Sikh immigrants in Canada and the US. So this is some blow-ups from the local newspaper. These were some of the very first ones to cross illegally, apparently, from Canada into Whatcom County, and they were discovered in somebody's barn in the Blaine area or Ferndale, I forget where, and they didn't know what to make of them. They sort of made fun of their names, and they were returned to the border because they didn't have the proper papers. And but they were kind of considered interesting and exotic because Whatcom County hadn't really seen people from India at the time. This was in the early 1906 or so. And but at the same time this was happening, the first international students at the normal school, which became Western Washington University, arrived. And this is A.K. Mazumdar, and he came to the normal school. He was older than most of the students. Most of the students were young women, but the principal, Edward Mathis, and we still have a building on the western campus called Mathis Hall, he's remembered. He, for some reason, befriended people from India. We're not really sure. He was known as a friend of India, but he invited this mystic who came to the US there was a real hunger for Hindu mysticism and theosophy, and he came to polish his English in Bellingham around 1905, and as far as I know, he's the first international student at Western, or what became Western. And the second one was, if you see the man on the left seated with all the female students, this was Nabi Ram Joshi, who was 19 years old, and he came in the fall of 1907 at the same time that there was all this hubbub about what are we going to do with these hundreds of Sikhs, these Punjabis working in the lumber mills. And he was there quietly living in the household of Edward Mathis, treated like a member of the family, with little, I think, Henry sitting on his lap. And there's all these letters at Western about this great relationship between Nabi Ram and the Mathis family. And he was there to study English. And after 1 year, he went on to University of Washington and studied chemical engineering. And he joined the Gadar movement as a supporter a little bit, but he went back to India and became a chemist or pharmacist, I believe, but he kept up this correspondence with the Mathis family. And now there's actually, at Western, there's a scholarship in his name that descendants of the Mathis family encouraged and put up some money, I think. The Bellingham Herald had this tradition, I guess a lot of papers had little one-line or two-sentence cryptic editorials. And this was the editorial on the morning that the riot was going to break out. There was apparently, the Herald knew that there was trouble afoot, but it was also right after Labor Day, and classes were about to begin at the normal school, and they knew that there was this Indian, this so-called high caste Hindu student. So they said they were predicting that this high-class Hindu would be treated better than the low-class Sikhs, Punjabis in the mill. And then they said, even there's no such thing as caste in this democratic country of I think they meant of ours. So kind of the irony, here we're democratic and we criticize India for being, having a caste system, but they were predicting, and it turned out their prediction was very true, that the workers in the mills were driven out, and Nabi Ram Joshi was told, oh, that's fine, you're here to study, we don't have a problem with that. So that was happening at the same time. I like to think also it does show two sides of the reception in Whatcom County and of people. Studying the riot as I have, and looking at prejudice and xenophobia and hatred and fear of people who are different, you begin to really get a very dark feeling about people and history. But if you also pay attention to people like Edward Mathis and his family that really treated Nabi Ram Joshi as a member of the family, you see that, both things were happening. Some don't get in the papers and don't get in the headlines. So around this time, or right before, this actually is a newspaper article that came out almost exactly a year before the Bellingham riot happened. So this was in September 1906, when these ships were coming and Punjabis by the hundred were arriving in Canada, and they were coming by the dozens across the border into Washington State, many of them stopping in Bellingham looking for work, some of them getting work in the factories. There were, I think, 37 when this article came out, something in the 30s. And they started saying, do we have apparel? Notice the word dusky. We don't use this word very much, but people were very color conscious in the newspapers, and I suspect it represented people's feelings. So the people from India were called dusky. Most papers didn't call them black, but they didn't consider them white. And I found that at this time, dusky was also used for light-skinned African Americans. It was a term that was used. It meant, I guess, brown skin, but it was very racial. And you notice they use the word hordes, this idea of the yellow peril, the yellow hordes. Hordes of Hindus was a common thing in many California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia papers because of the alliteration. It sounded scary, you think about Genghis Khan with hordes or something. Anyway, they commissioned a local artist to do a life portrait of one of the local Sikhs. And you can also see this artist also fantasized about people in India. Can you see a little reed instrument taming a cobra. So there's the reality here as well as the exotic in this picture. But it was really, at this time, the beginning of some stirrings. Once there were 35 or so Punjabi Sikhs in the community, people started worrying about it. This is around the same time in Canada. Another article a little bit later in May talking about fears and sanitation problems. Different things would get brought up in the newspapers as complaints or fears about the Punjabis, the Sikhs. I use Punjabis because we don't know that they were all Sikhs, that the estimates based on educated guesses is 85% to 90% of the Punjabi immigrants to Canada and the US were Sikhs, and maybe 10 or 15% were Muslim or Hindu. Words like pestilence, nuisance, undesirable. It's interesting, a lot of the same terminology had been used some 18 years before when the Chinese were driven out of Tacoma, Seattle, Bellingham, Everett, and lots of places up and down the coast of California and Oregon. The 1885-86 was a huge anti-Chinese movement. And if you look at the language that was used in the arguments and the fears, very similar, kind of recycled. And if you really want to extend it, you could say some of those same arguments and fears were used about Native Americans, about Japanese, today about Mexicans, Hispanics, some common stereotypes and just language, I think, of the other being undesirable. We know, unfortunately, very little about the perspective of the Sikhs themselves at this time in Bellingham. And one of the few Sikhs who told his story was Tuli Singh Joel, and actually Satpal is related to him through his wife, I believe, right? His wife's family. But Tuli was interviewed, he lived into his 90s in California, and he was interviewed when he was quite old, and he talked a little bit about coming through Bellingham. He didn't have a lot of details, but he kind of corroborated what the newspapers said. And he ended up becoming a very productive farmer in the Yuba City area, which is near Sacramento, where a lot of Punjabis ended up farming. And his son became one of the first MDs from India in California, and I interviewed him, and this is where I got this photo. And from his family, I learned that what's interesting is he, and I think this was typical, they came in groups from a village. So he came with, I think, 6 other men from his village in the Jandiala part of Punjab. And one of the people, one of his friends, was not Sikh. And at that time, in Punjab, the Sikhs and the Muslims and the Hindus were very friendly. There wasn't a big division. And in fact, when they came to Canada, because the Sikhs were the largest group, they would set up these temples, and the few people who might be Hindus would sometimes go to that temple. So Tuli's friend was one of those people, and I interviewed his sons in Canada. He never did cross over to Bellingham and to Canada. His family stayed in Canada. And I also interviewed a descendant of a Muslim from Punjab, and some of them became very successful farmers in California also. So not all of the Punjabis were Sikhs. So September 4th, 1907 was the beginning of the riot that probably all of you know something about. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details. There is a videotape that you can see that's now on YouTube the Sikh community in Whatcom County paid for a video. How many of people have seen it? It's called We're Not Strangers. It's a 15-minute video, and it gives you a nice picture of it. Satpal and I are both movie stars on this documentary. But anyway, you can search for it. We're Not Strangers, and you can find it on YouTube. Tells some of the story, but the basics is that maybe 500 or so people rioted. There were mobs. They weren't all together. There were several groups, but they congregated around the mills and around some of the boarding houses, which were around the lettered streets and the waterfront area. And they rounded up a lot of these Punjabi workers, threatened them. A few got clubbed, but nobody got hurt really badly. Some ran off up the creek into the water and got stoned by some young people, supposedly. And anyway, Bellingham had 33,000 people at the time, and there were only 9 policemen for a city of 33,000. So the police had a hard time controlling a mob of several hundred people. And there was talk afterwards that the police were kind of sympathetic to the rioters anyway. But the police chief, to keep order, he made a deal. We hear a lot these days about deals. He kind of made a deal with the rioters that to keep anyone from getting hurt, that the police, if all the Punjabis were taken downstairs of this building, which was City Hall at the time, and the police had a little lockup in the basement. I've never been to the basement here, but I guess we should have a tour there sometime. But if they brought these Sikhs down there, the police would hold them overnight, and then they could leave in the morning. And so there were about 100 or so who were locked up downstairs, and they came willingly because they were really afraid of getting clubbed or killed. And then there were a lot more who just ran along the railroad tracks and went north up to BC. We don't know how many just fled. And there were 5 men who were arrested. They were later released because supposedly nobody in Bellingham was willing to testify against them. This is a very common thing with race riots against the Chinese. You know, it was against Punjabis that hardly anyone ever was brought to trial in any of these events. And interestingly enough, I always wondered before I found that 1906 newspaper, how did they get an artist's rendering on the day of the riot? Did they know there was going to be a riot? What happened was the Bellingham, the Reveille, had bought up the Puget Sound paper, which had gone out of business that had a year before, and someone remembered, we have in our files this drawing by Charles Dibble, and they recycled it a year later. So that kind of solved that mystery for me, but it was just a lucky find that I found the Puget Sound American article. This was a photo, and it was hard to see people's faces. This appeared in the Herald. Hindus hounded, so another alliteration. They like that. And I was able to find a really glossy picture that appeared in the national magazine of the Collier's magazine, and I blew it up. And what's interesting, I think, about this photo, it shows you that a lot of these men had abandoned the turban, and because they were probably working in the mill, it was safer not to have long hair and a long turban that might get caught in one of these huge saws. And they were wearing kind of American-style hats and mustaches and maybe trying to fit in, trying to look like they were assimilating. And apparently, if you wore a turban in Bellingham at the time, you got harassed. That kids would follow you, try to knock the turban off. It was a game to be played in Bellingham and lots of other places. So it might have been a lot easier not to have the turban. But you see about half, I did a count of what I could tell in this photograph. About 50% are wearing turbans and 50% not. And this was the next day, that they were trying to decide once they got released from the basement of this building, what do we do now? And they were talking with city officials, well, we can protect you, and the mill owners wanted them to work, but they were afraid of their mill getting burned down, and this is what Tuli Singh Joel wrote about, that he left his mill. It hadn't been attacked because his mill was up at Whatcom Lake, and the rioters never got that far, but they were threatening to burn the mill down at Lake Whatcom, and so the Sikhs all decided to leave. Many of them left within 2 days after they got their paychecks, and I'll show you a picture of that later. But I wanted to just give you a little taste, especially since we just had a talk about oral history. This is very appropriate. This is Floyd Chandler, and he's one of the people who was recorded. He lived into his 90s, and he had an excellent memory. I talked to his granddaughter who lives in Ferndale, and she said he was just had an amazing memory. But he was talking about lots of things. He was a carpenter, a union guy, and in the course of this 1976 interview, he talked about the riot, which had happened 70 years before, and he remembered all kinds of details that I could corroborate in the paper. And he claims that his brother-in-law, he had just gotten married, and he remembered this. His brother-in-law tried to get him to join the riot, and he said, hell no, I don't have anything against them. Why do you want to do that? And his theory was that the mill didn't want them anymore, and they put up the workers to get rid of them, which I think is probably not very likely, but that was his story 70 years later. But his memory of where they lived, how many they were, all kinds of things was right on after 70 years. And I don't think he prepared for this interview because it wasn't mostly about this riot. I was just amazed that after 70 years, in his 90s, he remembered what street they lived on. Incredible. I found a newspaper clipping when I was down in the archive building that has the actual hard copies of all the Bellingham Herald and the Reveille, and I found this issue that never got microfilmed, and it had all these articles about the last of the Sikhs, and there were a few holdouts in what they called South Bellingham, which we now call Fairhaven, who were living, and they had paid their rent, and they didn't want to leave yet, and they hadn't gotten attacked. And if anyone has ever seen a stone mortar and pestle, maybe it's still in Fairhaven somewhere, but he was lamenting he wouldn't be able to take it with him when he left Bellingham. So I sort of have this fantasy that in someone's basement in Bellingham, they've got this mortar and pestle from India. So if you know of anyone who's got an old mortar and pestle, let me know. It might be the one shown in this article. This is their going back to collect their paychecks. There was a letter that I found in an archive in North Carolina. What he says about the Punjabis, who he called Hindus, like the newspaper, it's exactly what the newspapers were saying. So here's the question that I pose every time I give a talk on this. Were the newspapers accurately reflecting what educated people, because most of the newspaper writers and editors, they hung around, their friends were educated people. Were they kind of just telling us what educated people were thinking, or were people like Mr. Mangum, who read the newspaper, were they getting kind of propagandized and brainwashed by racist newspapers, or was it both? Bellingham wasn't the only place. There was a whole series of attacks against Punjabis. Bellingham was the largest. We think there were 300 or more who were driven out of the city. Nobody was killed, or it probably would have gotten more coverage. But Bellingham forgot about it very quickly. It was a big thing for a few weeks in the paper, and then almost nothing. And this was the proclamation 100 years later that the mayor, Tim Douglas, and the county executive, Pete Kremen, signed declaring in commemoration of the 100th anniversary, a day of healing and I've lost my word here, reconciliation. Satpal and I stumble on this word, healing and reconciliation, and we've used that for the arch that's going to be going up next month. So I'm going to turn things over to Satpal to talk about the Sikhs in the more recent decades.
So after 1907, for 75 years, no Sikhs or Asians ever came to Bellingham, maybe one or two, whatever. And then young bucks like me came here, had no knowledge. Hey, there is a job in Bellingham, let's go there. Because I remember that because my wife, her family came a long time ago, and she actually was 4 or 5 years old, and she grew up in Abbotsford. And when I came here, we got married, and my father-in-law would always say, oh, you guys going to Bellingham? Come home early. After 5 o'clock, you should come. We had no idea, why would he say that? Okay, sure, But I think that people in British Columbia, being so close, just a few miles, knew what went on in Bellingham, but nobody either didn't know the details or they didn't want to talk about it. But they had some kind of a fear, about coming in Bellingham. Now, after 1986, when Expo started and we had NAFTA, and suddenly, there are 250,000 people just across the line. There are 250,000 East Indians living in that area, and none of them would come here. It was just like from the generations, but untold kind of story. And then after that, and suddenly people start coming here, and now we saw the growth. Today, there are more than 4,000 Sikhs living in Whatcom County. And this started after mid-80s. So that was the thing, and today, the farmers, I want to talk about that because where we come from, province of Punjab, that's how India is. Punjab is Punjabi language, Gujarat is Gujarati, Bengal is Bengali. India has 20-some states. The states are based on language. India has 17 official languages. All these 17 languages, even alphabet is not the same. Even the script is not the same. The grammar is not the same. On our dollar bill, it says 17 times $1, $1, $1, $1. Really, all the currency, if you look closely, it's 17 times it says $1 in each language. And these are the languages which are accepted by the parliament, means official. There are more than that languages. And those things have been for centuries based on language. Madras is Madrasi language. Bengal is Bengali language. Gujarat is Gujarati language. Punjab is Punjabi language. That's how, it's many countries within a country. And for 1,000 years, it still has been one country. That's the amazing part. With different religion, different food, different dress up, different God, but it's still the one country. So it's an amazing example. So where we come from, we are basically very farming country. The logo we have, beautiful Washington. The logo we have, bread basket of India. Punjab is 1/3 the size of Washington state after partition, not before. Means after 1947. 1/3 the size of Washington state. Guess how many people? 28 million. So you bring whole California in just 1/3 of Washington state or half of Washington state. But at the same time, it is a leading agricultural state. The land, Punjab, the Punj means 5, Ab means river. The literal name is land of 5 rivers. It's so delta means all the fertile land, and it's breadbasket of India. So the people know farming. So when these Punjabis came to Whatcom County, and people used to laugh at them. Oh, they come here, they nothing know about berries, and they're buying land. They're gonna fail. Because I have lived in Lynden all along. I had several friends. They said, "What these guys are doing, Satpal? Tell them. They don't know nothing about berries." I said, "No, they know the land. They know the dirt. They don't need to know berries." and in less than 20 years, half of the berries, and these people have started who bought 5 acres, 10 acres, and they're competing with people who had ancestral land, didn't have to pay $1 for their 200, 500 acre farms because they just inherited. And they were up against them. In 20 years, half of the berry farms in Whatcom County are Punjabi owned. And they are very successful farmers, technically as well. You know, so that's it a special character. And another thing what we did, we were counting one day with people sitting, that these 4,000 people, they have created more jobs in Whatcom County than the total adult population. That's is in our blood. Agriculture, army, business. So this is in a berry farmer up in Whatcom County. You know, we then, after like Paul explained, and we had a declaration of healing and reconciliation, then we promised that we want to build a memorial to this event. It's not that we wanted to build a memorial for the resentment of people, but we wanted to build a memorial so that we remember that let this not happen again. We should tell our future generations that this is something is not right, and we should resist anything like that. And that's when we were planning, you know, all together, and we were very cognizant. Paul has been doing a lot of research since we started in 2006, and we learned about Japanese. Of course, we knew about that, the Chinese, and we did a lot of research about that. At that time, we thought, you know, we don't want to just make it only a Sikh or Punjabi memorial or Indian people memorial. Let's work with all of them. So we invited the Chinese community and Japanese community. They really liked the idea. We said, let's do it together. And that's what we are building, a permanent symbol and in the honor and remembrance. And it's all about welcoming all the immigrants. This is a gathering in 2007. After the declaration, we had a gathering at the Lynden Temple, and maybe some of you were there. And this is, we were so proud, we were so pleased to see the love from so many people. You know, after 9/11, there was an incident. Some kids in a pickup truck were throwing eggs at the temple sign, and we next day was in the Bellingham Herald. That day, next day, there were 300 people with flowers, with other cards. They came. They said, "No, we are here. We are with you. We know who you are." I mean, that's what is really the strength of the community and the character of the community. And I can attest that I've been here 30 years. We have found a very welcoming community. What a difference in 100 years. This is again at the Pete Creman and Terry Borneman. This was the actual declaration at the Rotunda at the county courthouse. This is last year on September 4, 2007, at 110 year. So we did the groundbreaking ceremony, and you can see in the back, that's the arch. And arch, why build arch? People, when we wanted to do memorial, a lot of people suggested, like, get a big stone and carve it on it and put it on the ground, you know. So we were thinking of creative ways that how should we memorialize this thing. And then reading the things and everything, it came to us, at least in our religion, Dwara means a doorway. Doorway means it's a different perspective. You walk through a doorway is the change of the attitude, the change of your perspective. So even our temple is called Guru Dwara. You probably heard. Guru means teacher. Dwara means teacher's doorway. So if you walk through the teacher's doorway, you are surrendering and you're wanting to learn. You're wanting to your yearning for learning is clear when you walk through that doorway. So that's why we thought, and first we built it just a little round one, you know. We didn't want people to think, oh, this is a Muslim thing, because you know how things people perceive, and we just built a round one and took it to Arts Commission. And they said, you know, we gave them 3 or 4 rendering. They said, we like this one. We said, you know, we don't want it, you know, backlash and all that. They said, no, this is great. You should build an archway which is traditional Indian style. So this is solid granite. It weighs, it is 2 pillars and an arch on top. The total weight is about 20,000 pounds. It's one solid 2 feet by 2 feet, single piece pillars and single piece arch built in red Indian granite. And so this is the day from the groundbreaking ceremony last year. Indians have made a lot of contributions. You know, a lot of people talk about immigrants and all this, and especially it's been very high attention topic, and Paul talked about 100 years ago was the same thing. These people come and take away our jobs. You know, I think the rhetoric hasn't changed, and these people don't fit into our society. They speak a different language. I mean, I think, you know, we should be proud that a person can speak 5 languages. And we want to force people, don't learn any language, just English is good. So, you know, so when we go to school, you have to learn your mother tongue, you have to learn English. English is India's national language. So you learn Hindi, that Hindustan is Hindi. And then you learn that they made a rule that you learn a language of the state which is not contiguous to your state. Because contiguous, you get filtered, right? You know, leaking, right? But you got to learn a language which is not contiguous to your state. So that you learn more languages, you know. So, like I said, that if you look at today, CEO of Microsoft is a first-generation Indian. CEO of Google is first-generation Indian. CEO of Adobe is first-generation Indian. I mean, these guys are not born here. MasterCard. He's first-generation Sikh. Pepsi-Cola. She's been chairman of Pepsi for about 10 years now. She's from India. Nokia. Chairman of Nokia is from India. Bose, you know, Bose speakers, you know. That guy is Amar Bose. He's a Bengali. And Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's, all 3 people under him, they're all Indians. And many others. I just picked some. You know, when people say, what is your contribution, you know? So, and like I said before, Punjabis and Gujaratis, you know, the current Prime Minister of India is from Gujarat. You know, Mahatma Gandhi, he was from Gujarat. These 2 states, people were very enterprising who would come. People from Punjab came to Oxford like in late 1800s. And same was Gandhi, 1889 or something, he came to Oxford. So these were the more enterprising people, because the rest of the states, they never ventured out. Both of these communities are really into business-minded. Now, Sikhs have been a minority in India. Even today, we are only 1.5% of Indian population. And in America, we are less than 1/4%, you know, if you look at overall. But however, they have made a lot of significant contributions. They have always been a minority. At one time, Punjabis made up 30% of Indian Army. Being 1.5% of the population, 30% of total Indian Army were Sikhs. Then Punjabis are good farmers, called breadbasket. You know, in California, there's a person, Mr. Charanjit Singh Bhatt, he's called Raisin King. Means he has the highest number of acreage of grape in California, and he is the probably world's largest raisin producer. And he is a first-generation immigrant. And then there is Mr. Singh Samra. He's called Okra King. He has farms up in Mexico, and here he's big produce and thing. And there are a few others too. I mean, there are many too, but there are a lot of other fruit and growers. Prime Minister of India, we are 1.5%. You've probably seen him. He was Prime Minister of India for 10 years. Sikhs at Vatican. This is the Chief of Indian Army, and this is just 4 years ago. He was the, like we have Joint Chief of Staff, same thing. The current Chief Defense Minister of Canada, he's a veteran from Iraq and Afghanistan, and he is just got elected. He's from Vancouver, and he's the Defense Minister of Canada. And of course, these are the two young people in U.S. Army. And it's not too long ago that U.S. Army approved that you can have beard and turbans and everything and still serve in the Army. Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley is daughter of a Sikh immigrant from Amritsar. Yeah, her parents are Sikhs, mother, father, and she's born in South Carolina. And she was governor, and now is the UN ambassador. And Bobby Jindal, he's another Punjabi born in here, and he was governor of Louisiana. Mr. Singh, Mr. Narendra Singh Kapani, and he's an Indian-born physicist, and he is called father of fiber optics. He invented fiber optics. Here is the first Sikh congressman was elected from California in 1954. And he was first-generation immigrant at that time. And here is with President Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And this is the guy I talked about, the CEO of MasterCard. This guy, Preet Bharara, you probably heard about him, the US attorney in Manhattan. He's a Punjabi. And then Ujjwal Dosanjh, he was the premier of British Columbia just a few years back. And the young man at the end, he just got elected as leader of NDP, a third party in Canada. And so he has the possibility of becoming Prime Minister of Canada. This is the arch. Like I said, that we wanted to build a doorway. Those black spots, we have 4 plaques. One is the proclamation of healing and reconciliation. Then we have plaque for each for 1885 for the Chinese, and 1907 for the Sikhs or Punjabis, and then 1942 for the Japanese. So those plaques will be there. And the floor is granite floor, and it has 12 by 18 black granite slabs. And each one of them, we are writing the word welcome, nothing else. And in the middle is welcome in Lummi language and Nuksak language. And all around we have welcome in Punjabi and Hindi and Urdu and Persian and in Russian and Ukrainian and Chinese and Japanese and Vietnamese, or like whatever we could gather. So we are just putting the word welcome and putting all around it. And then there will be spot that in future, if we want to take one plate out and put a new one in, we didn't want to write anything else on it, just that this is a welcome. And I went and presented to the Lummi Business Council, 3 weeks ago. And I went to ask them that we would like to honor you, and because you are actually the first welcomer to the rest of the people. So you should be there. And they were very pleased, and they sent a support letter as well. And I talked to the Nuksak people as well. So Arch of Healing, I think that we are very lucky being in this community. When we started this project, it was, we had a big dream, but we didn't know, we just started, we said, okay, well, let's work in the community. And RAM Construction was the first one. We shared the project with them. They said, Satpal, we'll do all the construction. You don't have to worry about it. And they donated, or not only labor, all the materials, everything. They said, we'll do the foundation, we'll do all the floor around it, everything. So that was very, very generous of Mike Hams. And then Whatcom Community Foundation, they were our fiscal agents. We started working with them from the very start, and they gave a very generous donation on behalf of the whole community. Of course, the Lynden Sikh Temple and Sikh community, as well as all other people. I just would like to invite you all on April 21st. We are actually installing that arch. It's getting ready right now. So please remember April 21st. It is Saturday, 10:30 in front of the City Hall. This is something I just wanted to share with you. This is our scripture. There is all but one well. We all draw the water from. The containers may be different, but all carry the same water. Okay, that's the end of our presentation, and we would welcome the questions so that we can have some discussion going here.
Historically, you did not explain, perhaps you can, why Sikhs and Punjabs came to Canada and the United States. Was there any harsh activities going on? Were they thrown out? What motivated them to come?
Yeah. You know, the Hindu religion has a tradition, or in their scriptures, not to cross the ocean. And you know how traditional people are. Sikhs are free from all that. No caste system, women are equal, and everybody is equal. And they had no inhibition about traveling. And same was Gujaratis. Even they are Hindus, but they were more progressive. I would say that is the more than anything else that the parents and everybody, they would say, yes, you want to venture, go ahead. You know, I think that's what was the major reason.
Could I add something to that?
Oh, yes, please.
What I heard also was it had to do with, as land got divided, if someone had several sons, the farmland would get divided between the sons, and some families just didn't have enough land, so some of the sons, the most able-bodied sons, were often encouraged to go, and it was very expensive to get passage. So people from the village, uncles, aunts, a lot of family members would contribute so that this person could go to Canada or Australia or Fiji or wherever, make some money, send it back, come back after a few years.
I guess another reason why the Sikhs were more immigrating to the US and Canada was because many of them were in the British Army, British Indian Army, and wherever the British were, of course the Sikhs were either going there as police members or army soldiers, and then they had the more opportunity to travel where the British were, either in Canada or the US as well. Even Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, etc.
In fact, some of those who we were able to track down who were working in Bellingham had names or nicknames of what their rank was in the British police or army. You know, I'd ask someone like Satpal or someone else, what does this name mean? Oh, that means lieutenant or sergeant. And in fact, one was called Sergeant Singh, So a lot of them were very proud of their medals and their service, but that's how they did learn some English. So some of the people who were able to speak more English in Bellingham and speak to the city council and to the mayor had served in the army or the police.
I want to say a couple of things on the middle name, like Singh. You know that India has a caste system. It's so organized that if you tell somebody's last name, you can tell where they're from, what their religion is, what caste is, what profession they have. It was so organized for 4,000 years. So in the Sikh religion, the edict was that everybody is equal. The easiest way in those days was you drop your last name. Now, there is no past identity to you.
Well, you know how in America, within the Christian religion, you can have at least two political leanings, maybe three, maybe four. How does the Sikh religion or community address that? What's it like in terms of politics?
You mean in America?
Yes, in America.
I think that, this is more like a personal thing for people, but we, in our religion, are supposed to be politics-free. But it never happens. As a human beings, it doesn't really quite happen that way. So it's more like people's personal choices. People like, especially in Canada, people like Liberal Party because they had, and Democrats because they had a progressive immigration policies. So that was the deciding factor who you're going to vote for, because who's going to promote immigration. So that was one of the likings, because otherwise they're business people, but they would vote Democrat. Yes, please.
It's been represented to me that 500 years ago that the Sikh was the warrior class of the Hindu religion, and they evolved from there into a very separate ideology. Now, could you correct me if I've been misinformed or elaborate on that?
It's not a matter of correction, because we were something else before we became something else. If you go back 4,000 years, there was no Christians, right? So maybe all the Christians were Jews. But what about 4,000 years before that, right? So this is a process of reforming or morphing into something new. So it doesn't have a direct relationship of that it was separated. Actually, our religion was not even a religion. It's a way of life. Actually, if you look at our religion, it never said, oh, Hindus are better, or Sikhs are better, or Christians are better. It said, are you a better person? It was all individual. What we believe in is religion is a individual, private thing. It's not a group activity, it's private activity. How you perceive, I'll tell you an example that if there is a death in a family, how everybody goes through that pain or sorrow is individual. You and your brother or your sister or your wife cannot have the same perception of that loss. It's individual, even though it's a group loss. So our religion gives more to the individual person, how good a person you are, not that which group you belong to. Of course, over time, we are all tribal people. We like our tribes, But in essence, that's what it is. So I really don't have an answer that they were Hindus, they formed into something. We were all something before that.
I should mention that because in the early period, India was called Hindustan, and people in Canada and the US didn't really understand that much about India. The term that they used, whether it was respectful or pejorative, in all the papers for anyone from India tended to be Hindu, which meant someone from India, from Hindustan. Once in a while, they would call them Sikhs, but if you go back into the Bellingham papers, Canada papers, California papers, it was always Hindu. It became, once there was this anti-immigrant sentiment and movement, Hindu became to have more of a pejorative, negative connotation, but it never really meant in this country followers of the Hindu religion. So just something to, if you're looking at history and wondering, it is confusing in English because the word Hindu will get used for the religion, but it's also, 100 years ago, was the common term for the people.
Like Afghanistan, we call them all Afghanis, but if you really look into more, they may not be the same. And stan actually means a place of abode, where you live. That's why you have so many stands, in the name of the countries. So that's how this came about. Yes, he's right. Where people lived, that is called Hindustan.
And sometimes the Punjabis were called Afghans.
Yeah. Yeah. Because of the turban and the beard. Yes, please.
So when I arrived in Bellingham in the early 70s, I was told one reason why there aren't a lot of blacks in the community was that the police department had a habit of finding any blacks and putting them in their police car and driving them to the Skagit County border and dropping them off and telling them never to come back again. Have you heard anything like that? Is there any basis for that?
Yeah, in fact, I ran across that while I was looking to see what, I looked at the police records. If you're interested, Bellingham has the complete police records in the archive building going back to the founding of Bellingham, 1904. And every time they arrested a Hindu, they would assess them a lot of fines. If it was a white person, they would release them the next day if they were arrested for being drunk, which was the common arrest. The next day, people who weren't Hindus or weren't African American were released per order of the police chief with no fine. So it looked like there was some profiling going on. And then I noticed, I wasn't looking for this, but I noticed when there was someone called Negro, because they had a column for race, when someone was Negro, written in script was something I couldn't quite decipher. I finally figured out it was fired. There was this big thing, I didn't know if it was an S or an F, fired out of town, and I looked it up and finally figured out what fired out of town in 1907 meant you got taken outside of town if you were a vagrant or if you didn't have a domicile here, and you were African American especially, you were told don't come back. And that's what happened. And I interviewed a former police chief, and he said that this was happening. He claimed it wasn't racial, but exactly what you're describing was happening through the 1960s, maybe into the 1970s. He said it was for vagrants, for hobos, undesirables. He said it wasn't racial, but they would take them to the Skagit border or to the state park area and say, don't come back if they didn't have a residence here. But the word of mouth is that this was racial. The police denied it. And actually there's, speaking of oral history, is Anna still here? I think she might be the one who told me about this, or maybe it was Jeff Jewell, the photo curator here at the museum, that we have a tape of a man, I forget his name now, who served as the magistrate for a while, and for the centennial of Bellingham, he's on tape with a centennial oral history talking about, he asked this police guy, how is it I never see black people in my courtroom? And he was told that that's what they did. This was in the 50s, I think he was referring to.